He learned how to walk and speak only at the age of 3. He would bang his head against the floor, and as he went into hysterics, everybody feared that the child would grow up defective. Volodya Ulyanov stood on the edge of life and death several times. When he was 9, he went fishing with his friend and fell into the water. He began to drown. The boy nearly died, but he was rescued by an ordinary distillery worker. These are episodes you won't find in any official account of Lenin's life. Here you'll see the secret biography of the Bolshevik leader. We have reconstructed it from the memoirs of his relatives and friends. These tales show the real, non-idealized man at the wheel of the revolution, Vladimir Lenin. On the 21st of January 1924, Nadezhda Krupskaya squeezed her husband's hand. He was dying. Aged 53, he looked like a wizened old man. He had lost his memory and the ability to speak, and had become senile a long time ago. At night he howled and whined, frightening the guards in Gorky. Krupskaya listened to his breaths during the intervals between attacks, and in some instances, it seemed to her that he whispered something. He said only 2 words: "Forgive me." What could he apologize to his wife for? Nadezhda Krupskaya knew what. For the many long years of a loveless marriage. For the fact that they had never had a baby that she wanted so much. For loving all the other women without hiding it. On the 21st of January at 6:50 p.m., Lenin passed away. He didn't suspect that from that moment he would become the Soviet idol, the immortal symbol of the revolution. That was the reputation which was created for him by his successor Joseph Stalin, though Lenin's relatives didn't approve of it. Stalin ordered historians to create Lenin's fake biography. He censored all memoirs about him personally. Bit by bit, he removed all Lenin's bad habits and weaknesses from history, so that no one could ever learn about the real past of Vladimir Ulyanov.
A perfect childhood, selfless youth, followed by exile and sacrifices for the people's sake. Every man and woman in the Soviet Union knew him as the kind Grandpa Lenin and loved him. Everyone knew about his kindness, simplicity, intellect, and his love of his fellow men. But no one knew what he was really like.
Here he is, ever living, surrounded by the pieces of his so-called impeccable life and holy deeds, according to iconography. The first fragment is his idyllic childhood.
This is a little Oktoberist star badge. It was the envy of every Soviet kindergarten-age child. Little Octoberists would parade them, and children even left their jackets unbuttoned so that everyone could see that they were young Leninists. There were 2 kinds of star badges. Plastic ones were considered cool. One could only get them through good connections. The ordinary badges were made of metal. All school children wore them pinned to their shirts. In the center of each one, there was a portrait of an angelic boy. It is a young Volodya Ulyanov. He was a superboy. At that time, children admired him no less than how they admire Harry Potter now.
Incredibly, the real Volodya Ulyanov was nothing like an angel. According to Lenin's sister Anna's memoirs, her little brother was a true family disaster. Loud and hysterical as a child, he learned to walk and speak at the very late age of 3. If he fell, he didn't get up himself, but went into hysterics and banged his head against the floor. His hysterics were so frequent between the ages of 3 and 4 years that the boy's mother worried about her son's mind. In order to stop the tantrums, she seated him in a special black armchair so that he could sit for a while and calm down. The mother kept wondering, what's the matter? The older and younger children were so obedient and good, but her third son was mad.
Self-assured, abrupt and mischievous boy. One can hear more often at home, Volodya, don't be rude, Volodya, be quiet.
Full words, Lenin's elder sister Anna recollects his childish tricks. Her most vivid recollection was how happily Volodya destroyed toys, how industriously he twisted the legs off the new toy horse, squeezed the eyes of his sister's dolls. However, his favorite joke was on his younger brother, Mitya.
This book was something like a Bible to Soviet children. These are short stories about Lenin by the famous satirist Mikhail Zushchenko. They are well known to people over 30. The most memorable is the one, The Little Grey Goat. It tells how Volodya taught his younger brother not to be afraid of the song about the little grey goat that is eaten by the wolf. The truth behind it, however, is somewhat different.
The youngest amongst the Ulyanov brothers, Mitya, was very compassionate. He always cried when he heard the song about the terrible end of the grey goat. But Volodya taught him to be courageous. Volodya's elder sister Anna Ulyanov recollects it.
When his brother lost his courage and tried to sing, Volodya made a face and would sing very loudly.
A big hungry wolf has attacked the little goat and left nothing for the granny apart from just a couple of horns.
Why was the third son of the Ulyanov family unlike the others? Why did he break everything, offend younger children and have hysterics? The answer is in the Ulyanov family secrets. Actually, the life of little Volodya was very hard. He had 5 brothers and sisters, 2 older and 3 younger ones. The difference in ages was small, only a year and a half. As a result, the nervous and sickly boy was not given much attention, even though he was difficult from birth and probably needed it more than the other children. His father was severe, cold and tyrannical. The mother was always preoccupied by the housework. There was no real love in this family. And in time, Volodya understood that there was only one way to draw attention to himself. He should be the best and the cleverest. He should graduate with honors and enter university. He should be an exemplary Ulyanov. It was these merits that the parents expected from all their children. The mother is the main person in the Messiah's life. Therefore, it is Mother Mary who is esteemed most in Christianity, rather than old Joseph. And it is this role that the Soviet Canon creators assigned to another Maria, Lenin's mother.
Mother's hands are the most gentle and tender. They can do everything. Mother's heart is the most faithful and sensitive. It is always full of love. She really cares about everything. This image of Lenin's mother was created by the children's writer Zoya Voskresenskaya. Mother's Heart was once popular among primary school children and is a history about the large and united Ulyanov family, about the mother and her perfect young Volodya. These tales depict him as a family's favorite, a hero. He releases the birds. He wraps up his father's cherry tree from the frost and helps his mother. I wonder how it was in real life.
Maria Blank liked the late evening. Children had already gone to bed and the house became silent. At that time, she could stay alone with her thoughts at last. Maria was well educated and ambitious. As a young woman, she was a maid of honor at the court of Alexander II. She was half Jewish and half German, a beautiful and clever woman. She never imagined she would live an ordinary life in the provinces and become a housewife and a tutor to her children. So how did it happen? Why did she leave court suddenly and marry Ilya Ulyanov, the son of the christened Kalmyk? After she had left court suddenly, a persistent rumor spread that the maid of honor Maria Blank had had an affair with the great prince himself, the future Tsar Alexander III. They said that a child would be born of that affair. That is why she was urgently sent to Simbirsk and was married to the ordinary teacher Ulyanov. Thus, at the age of 28, Maria Blank left the capital, got married, and after a few months gave birth to Anna, the possible daughter of the young crowned Prince Alexander. Soon afterwards, the schoolteacher Ulyanov began to rise quickly until he was finally made director of elementary schools in the Simbirsk province and reached the rank of state councillor. The second child in the family was Sasha. And soon rumors began to go around in Little Simbirsk. The old residents still tell that Alexander Ulyanov was a child of forbidden love too. Because at that time, independent and freedom-loving Maria Blank kept up a close friendship with the revolutionary Dmitry Karakazov.
In the year 1866, there was an amazing coincidence in the Ulanovs' family life. Maria Blank gave birth to son Alexander, and in the same year, her friend Dmitry Karakazov shot at the emperor, Alexander II. The assassination attempt failed. Someone in the crowd had pushed Dmitry, and he had missed the emperor. The court sentenced him to death by hanging. That year, the Ulyanov family was in mourning.
Was Alexander Ulyanov really the son of the revolutionary Dmitry Karakazov? Nobody can confirm it now, but there was one more strange coincidence. After 20 years, Alexander, just like Dmitry Karakazov, took part in a plot to assassinate the other Tsar, Alexander III. It is he who probably was his mother's lover and his older sister's father. Did Sasha Ulyanov know about that? It is still a question. But that assassination attempt ended tragically for him as well, and like Dmitry Karakazov, he was sentenced to death and hanged. The third child born into this strange and disparate family was Volodya. The photo shows he was a living image of his father. He was the only child who looked like him. He descended from strict Kalmyks, Buddhists by faith. The blood of Kalmyks, Germans and Jews all mixed extraordinarily in this boy. Sickly, weak and nervous from birth, he demanded the attention of his busy mother in vain. She had another favorite in the family, Sasha. She was proud of his judgment, obedience and eagerness to study. Sasha was to graduate with honors. Sasha was to become an achieved biologist. To his mother, Sasha was the best example for the other children, and Volodya was highly annoyed about it. He therefore thought that his mother would pay him more attention if he became like Sasha.
A red pioneer tie is the next step of initiation for the schoolchild on his way to reaching the Soviet ideal. He is a pioneer now. Therefore, he is first in everything. A pioneer should study as well as Lenin did, and get straight A's. I studied well, even very well. Most of the day I would spend reading, writing, studying languages, translating, etc.
These are the lines by Zoshenko which young pioneers would have read, but the schoolmates of Lenin have left other memoirs. As Ulyanov's classmate Anatoly Kurymsky recollects, the son of the public schools director Volodya Ulyanov was an unfriendly child. He didn't take part in children's games, never explained homework to anyone, and did not let anyone look at his homework or tasks. His classmates didn't like him. Furthermore, the high school principal, Fedor Kerensky, looked after him too. He was a friend of Ilya Ulyanov, therefore he always took care of his children. At Kerensky's house, Volodya often played with the principal's little son, Alexander. After 40 years, they were to meet again. Alexander Kerensky was to head the provisional government, and Vladimir Lenin was to order the seizure of the Winter Palace, where the provisional government ministers were hiding in the autumn of 1917. But what made these boys join enemy camps? What turned this swot, Volodya Ulyanov, into a revolutionary? Perhaps it was the tragic fishing accident when the boy nearly died, but it wasn't being saved by a distillery worker that made him. It was not his father's premature death, nor his mother's precepts, nor thoughts for the poor peasants. What turned him into a revolutionary was his competition with his older brother.
All history textbooks in the Soviet Union claimed that Lenin had become a revolutionary to revenge his brother. After Sasha had attempted to assassinate Alexander III unsuccessfully, he was sentenced to death. But he might have stayed alive if he had asked for a pardon. But Sasha had refused and was executed. In response, Volodya said, "No, we'll go the other way."
That is the Soviet version of Lenin's biography. The true events are completely different. Sasha and Volodya never loved each other. The older they grew, the greater the abyss between them became. The older son was their mother's favorite and her hope. The second son was talented and ambitious, but too capricious and adolescent. He baited all members of the family, harassed his younger brother and sisters, and quarreled with his elders. While Sasha was studying the works of Marx and Engels, Volodya was reading Turgenev, which he had read many times before. Revolutionary ideas were of no interest to him at that time. He intended to dedicate himself to philosophy or history after high school. He got tired of competing with his brother for his mother's love. But suddenly, everything had changed. The father died. And in half a year after his death, suddenly something unbelievable happened. The calm and reasonable Sasha made an attempt on the Tsar's life. Nobody could believe it. The trial began. The mother cried. But Volodya was the most astonished and the most surprised by what his brother had done. Meek and mild Sasha turned out to be a revolutionary. And then, when in court, he had refused to ask for a pardon. It is a thin line between hate and love. Volodya Ulyanov crossed that line in a flash. Once his brother had been executed, he stopped being his rival. Volodya raised him to the pantheon of holy martyrs. And what's more, his heart was then overflowing with anger towards the savage regime and was filled with a desire for revenge.
If the court had showed mercy, there may not have been such revenge and revolution. and the course of history could have been very different. Lenin would not have become a significant political leader. However, that trial had a huge influence on his life and character, which became the most important part of our education system then.
He is 16. His priorities were unclear yesterday, but suddenly they have turned into a clear aim: to advance his brother's cause. He therefore enrolled in the Faculty of Law at the Kazan University. At university, Volodya was surprised to find out he was a celebrity, the brother of the famous Alexander Ulyanov. The young people who were enthusiastic about ideas of throwing over the monarchy adored him. They paid attention to everything he spoke of and believed in it. He bore that mark of the notable brother proudly, and at that time, he realized what gave him sheer delight. It was a desire to be a leader.
Then a scandal. First-year students barricaded themselves in the big hall. They demanded that the university authorities remove a new uncomfortable uniform. They also demanded that the administration reinstate the students expelled for reasons of policy. Vladimir Ulyanov was at the front line of these rebels. He was excited and perfectly happy as the leader of this rebellion.
The revolt was suppressed, but for young Ulyanov, it was a point of no return. He was expelled from the university and banished to the family estate in the village of Kokushkino. There, he avidly read books on history, economics, political science, and philosophy. He returned from exile after 5 years. He passed his final examinations and received a degree in law. But the bar was of no interest to him. He went to St. Petersburg and joined the local Marxist society, but everybody who had known him didn't recognize him. Ulyanov was 25, but he looked like a man over 40. He was red-bearded and had a cold and steady look in his eyes. He behaved in a harsh manner, worked very hard, and read or was writing something all the time. He spoke little and always kept to the point. It was pointless to argue with him. He lost his temper in an instant and started to shout at his less educated and less gifted Marxist comrades.
Everybody knows that Vladimir Lenin was married, but his wife has always been regarded as a comrade. After all, by the Canon, a leader should be single. He should think about all his people and, at the same time, think about every person individually. It was considered that Lenin loved children and had no interest in women. The reality is slightly different. The ardent revolutionary wanted to have children and loved women very much.
But as he joined the St. Petersburg Marxist circle, he lost his right to quiet family happiness. There he was, surrounded by young men and women who were too keen on the cause. The members of the society spoke only about party matters and the ideal of a fighter. They called one another comrade, which suggested each of them was neutral. The women who came there were smart rather than beautiful. But Volodya, in spite of everything, was an aesthete. Plain-looking, dressed with a lack of taste, and only 164 centimeters tall, Ulyanov nevertheless attracted women. And soon he already had 2 female Marxist admirers. One was the pretty Apollinaria Yakubova, whose pet name was Kubochka. The other was a smart but plain Nadezhda Krupskaya, disfigured by Graves' disease. Fellow party members cruelly nicknamed her Herring. Both women were schoolmistresses and devoted admirers of Volodya Ulyanov. They didn't even try to share him. Ulyanov, Kubochka and Krupskaya saw each other almost every day. They walked in the park together, talked, disputed on different matters. Volodya was in love with the vivid and energetic Kubochka. Nadia was in love with Volodya. The beautiful Kubochka was in love with the whole world. But soon this strange triangle had broken apart. In 1895, Ulyanov was arrested for creating an underground organization and for spreading propaganda illegally. He was sentenced to 3 years in exile. But beloved Kubochka did not go after him to Siberia, while Nadia Krupskaya joined him voluntarily. In Shushenskoye, Krupskaya proposed that they got married. At first he refused. He couldn't get that other woman out of his mind. But then he collected himself. He recalled the words of Chernyshevsky, "One ought not to think about oneself, one must think about one's important cause." And he married Nadezhda. That is how he explained his choice to his friends. "I have married Nadia because she was the only woman whom I knew who understood Karl Marx and could play chess." But during exile, it turned out that Nadia wanted not only to be a faithful comrade in arms, she wanted to be loved and dreamed about a real family. In Shushenskoye, she desperately tried to get pregnant. She suffered several miscarriages. She wrote to her mother-in-law in tears. As time went by, she sobbed through her grief. She realized they would never have children of their own. Her husband had said, "Never mind, we'll adopt," but they never did. Soon in Europe, Ulyanov met the Marxist Inessa Armand. He fell hopelessly in love with her. It was a lifelong love. But after several years, Ulyanov pulled himself together and repressed the feeling which distracted him from the fight. "For the sake of the revolution and the victory for socialism, in order to go down in history as a worthy proletariat leader, Lenin restrained himself in this aspect of his life." Nadia always knew about that love, but didn't tell her husband anything. She blamed herself for her miseries. She had failed to be a good wife and mother. Therefore, she became a loyal and faithful friend in the revolution. Every saint has to undergo the trial of his faith. He has to suffer from starvation and cold, and lead a simple life in order to strengthen his mind. For Ulyanov, that ordeal lasted a year and 2 months. It was the time he spent in jail before he was sent into exile. Being in prison, he, according to the official version, suffered from starvation but worked hard.
The most popular story from that period is the one about ink pots of bread and milk, which Lenin used to write secret messages. Almost every Soviet schoolchild tried to carry out this experiment at home. Let us try too. What we need is a writing tool, a sheet of paper, some milk, and some bread, from which we make an ink pot. The bread has to be mashed well. There, a primitive ink pot is finished. Now we have to fill it with milk. Let's try to write. Over the fire, an inscription must appear. Here, We can see it, therefore, it isn't a myth.
Letters written in milk really existed. As for the prison conditions in which Lenin lived, well, historians kept these secret on purpose. How did the poor prisoner get milk and bread? Not only bread, but also the latest magazines, books, and even mineral water from the chemist's shop. All these things were brought to him by his mother and sisters 3 times a day. And what is more, the prison authorities didn't starve prisoners. According to the records, the menu of Petropavlovskaya fortress for prisoners included cabbage or meat soup, roast meat or game, and a dessert. The exile also wasn't full of great ordeals, but rather looked like paid leave. KRUPSKAYA recollected the exile in Shushenskoye as golden days. She wrote that during the breaks in work, Volodya walked around the village, rode a bicycle, went fishing and hunting. Later, in order to create the image of the kind Grandpa Lenin, Soviet writers claimed that he never hunted for real. He took pity on animals and didn't kill them. But in fact, Vladimir Ulyanov wasn't so sympathetic. This is evident from one of the memoirs of Nadezhda Krupskaya. Once, Volodya returned from hunting more satisfied than usual. He brought 20 hare carcasses with him, but the poor animals hadn't been shot.
There was a flood in Shushenskoye. Of course, it sometimes happens on Siberian rivers. And Lenin sailed a boat towards the small islands where the hares were. The hares jumped into his boat, desperate to escape, and he stunned them with an oar and killed them. He then brought that sort of horrific gift back to his wife.
Nadezhda wasn't surprised by what her husband had done. She knew he wasn't inclined to sentimentality. Furthermore, in his everyday life, he didn't stick to his principles so much as he did in his work. While in exile, Ulyanov was working on the development of capitalism in Russia, and an 11-year-old servant girl chopped firewood, collected water, and tidied the rooms in his house. After 3 years, the exile was over, and Vladimir Ulyanov went to Europe with his wife to prepare for the revolution against the hateful regime.
Paris, Munich, London, Geneva. They had lived 17 years abroad. During that time, they had visited almost all European countries. Wine, theatres, beautiful women. Once a year, they always went on vacation for several weeks to spa resorts, the mountains, or the seaside. They could afford all of this thanks to the pension of the mother, who now refused nothing to Vladimir, because he followed the path of her beloved son, Sasha.
Ambitious and intelligent, Ulyanov easily entered Russian political immigration circles. He and his comrades published the newspaper Iskra and created the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. At that time, Vladimir started to sign his articles Lenin. It was one of his 160 pseudonyms which became permanent over time. The only thing that put people around Ulyanov on their guard and marked him out was his excessive nervousness. There in Europe, he met educated revolutionary theorists for the first time, and his theories of world transformation often didn't stand up to their criticism. It severely hurt his pride. He was nervous and day after day became more and more tense. The details of psychiatrists and neuropathologists appeared in his notebook from that period, and finally, a nervous breakdown happened. In 1903, the Social Democratic Party Congress was held in London. Lenin put everything at stake on it. He initiated a split within the party and set up one of his own called the Bolsheviks. But those efforts and arguments with his fellow members were costly for him. Right after the Congress, Lenin had a nervous breakdown and an attack. He was diagnosed with epilepsy. Lenin's biographers had concealed the truth about his attacks, his dreadful atherosclerosis and cerebral hemorrhages. This information was only published much later. At the same time, the scientific study of Lenin's brain proved that the disease had grown progressively worse all the time. Bursts of nervous activity led to uncontrolled aggression, and they reached their climax after 1917. Everybody remembers the scene. The year was 1917, and Lenin made a speech to a big crowd from the locomotive. And that speech triggered the revolution. But how did it really happen? Lenin had learned about Russian events by accident from the newspaper. He couldn't believe his eyes. Nicholas II had abdicated. The provisional government had come into power. The moment which he had despaired of ever coming had arrived. All he needed was to be there in time. He arrived in Russia from Germany when the tension among the people had reached its peak. On the way, Lenin had shaved to be unrecognizable. Right at the railway station, he delivered the famous speech.
Now the workers who have remained loyal to the cause of throwing off the yoke of capitalism can call themselves communists.
The speech had little resonance. There were 42 parties in St. Petersburg at that time, and the Bolsheviks went unnoticed.
It's hard to believe, but at that time, Lenin was little known in St. Petersburg. He took the lead in the revolution only by a stroke of good fortune. His genius laid in the fact that he succeeded in seizing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. In October 1917, during the joint session, most parties quarreled among themselves and left the hall. Only the Bolsheviks stayed, and Lenin urged them to vote for coup d'etat. The events unfolded with lightning speed, and he was a good strategist because he realized that there were 2 or 3 days in which those events could take place. The days previously would not have worked, and a few days later and he would have lost the opportunity. But those days close to the 25th of November were the very moment to act. And it really came off, and it turned out relatively bloodless.
Myths tell us a little about what happened after the October coup. Only separate images appear as illusions. Lenin at voluntary work on Saturday. Lenin with rusks and boiling water. Lenin talks to the Red Army man about how he gave up smoking. There was also a famous office where the lights were always on. It meant that Lenin was working. A few people knew what was going on in that office. In fact, the grand experiment on the large country was designed in there. This experiment became known as war communism. Vladimir Ulyanov himself was at the brink of a nervous breakdown at that time. The capacity for work is awfully bad because of diseased nerves. Everything went wrong. The revolution had been done, but the paradise didn't reign on earth. The hungry began to revolt and civil war began. The country went out of control, and the Bolsheviks forgot about their high ideals. They made desperate and brutal efforts to retain their power. Lenin gave senseless, bloody orders. Thus, the one who had overthrown the tyranny became a tyrant himself.
He often lost his temper. The Reds left one or another town sometimes, and he told them that they should have poured sulfuric acid on the road behind them so that the enemy's horses would fall. He also told them they should have driven nails into the road so that nobody who tried could pass.
Only 5 years had passed after the revolution. In this time, millions of people were killed. The country turned into a trap for all dissidents. But in the office in the Kremlin, a green lamp was always on. It meant that Lenin was working. But only a close circle of people saw what had happened to Lenin in this short period of time. Atherosclerosis, strokes, and numerous epileptic fits had, little by little, turned him into a wreck. Permanent nervous strain and frantic efforts to get control over all normal processes had ruined his brain. At night, he howled under the moon and frightened the guards.
It was an awful sight. This Kremlin dreamer, as they all like to call him, became insane. He was deprived of all the joys of life. He was a vegetable. Vegetable in a cap. He sat in a wheelchair and they took him out in Gorky. That's all that he was, and nothing more.
What he was afraid of most was of becoming completely paralyzed. He asked anyone to poison him, but he never got the poison. Nobody dared to kill the symbol of the revolution. Meanwhile, the madness crept up on him. There were certain lucid intervals, and at those moments, he felt that what he'd created was wrong. It wasn't what he'd wanted. And he tried to ask someone for help, but help didn't come. His supporters now advanced their own interests, made a career of their own. Actually, he had nobody to rely on. Days and weeks went by. His once active brain degraded steadily. Little by little, Lenin lost his ability to read and write, then his ability to speak. And finally, he turned into the capricious child again, who had given a lot of trouble to his parents in his time. After that, complete paralysis came. His suffering ended on the 21st of January, 1922. During the night, Lenin had 42 epileptic fits, one after another. He died without regaining consciousness. Nadezhda Krupskaya asked the comrades from Political Bureau not to build monuments and palaces to Lenin or name streets after him. She asked them to bury his poor, tormented body quietly, but nobody listened to the widow. She took part in her husband's canonization against her will. And she could tell nobody in the world at that time that before he became completely insane, Lenin had a lucid interval. He knew that the state machinery had been actually headed by Stalin, that purges among the old revolutionaries had begun, that the revolution had got out of hand and at that time devoured its children. At that lucid moment, Lenin asked his wife, how did it happen that the great idea turned into the pure evil? Nadia, why? And Krupskaya, for the first time, didn't know what to answer him. He lived for a good, bright dream, but he was too literal while fulfilling it. He paved the bloody way from repression with his good intentions. And at the end, it turned out that the Simbirsk boy, who had suffered from a lack of love, became the Soviets' idol, deprived of peace in his glass sarcophagus.